This is a much less formal situation than this morning. You can tell that I don't have a PowerPoint. I've traded my long sleeve shirt for a short sleeve shirt. I've given up the pulpit for a podium, although this is really great lectern. If you guys don't know that, I love this one. And so the goal here is for this to be more conversational. I like how Chip called it a workshop. I like that term. I think it's good when we work on things and study things together. So we spent time this morning talking about the process. Chip just shared what he sent this afternoon as well. And hopefully that process is relatively clear. But as I kind of maybe overburdened, hopefully not, the concepts of giving the elders feedback about the mission and guiding principles that they shared, I would just encourage you to think the exact same way about this process. Meaning, if there's some part of this process that is unclear to you, you need to ask questions. Do not assume that it is clear for other people and that you're the only one that doesn't understand. So Chip laid out that process via email. If there's some parts of that aren't clear to you, you should email him back or email all three of the elders preferably and make sure you share that so that if one person has that question, statistically in a group, at least 4 other people have that question also. So be a friend, ask the question, and that way they can share it for you, but also for the other 3, 4, or 5 people who maybe haven't asked that's not clear for either. I want us to start by reading 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 13. Usually we read this and think about this in terms of what qualities does a man have that will lead us to appoint him as a special servant, as a deacon. I don't want us to look at it with that lens. As Chip mentioned, that part of the process is 4 to 6 weeks away from where we are now. So we aren't talking about specific men yet. We're talking about specific work. And so I want us to look at this a little bit from that lens of, are there things we can derive about the work of the deacons by reading about what we often have called the qualifications of them? Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So we're going to take a minute or two. I'd like you to maybe write down any notes that you have from what we can tell about their work. You might also think about what we talked about in Acts 6 this morning. That could give you some thoughts as well. So we'll take 2 minutes, make some notes, and then we'll have some conversation about what we can tell so far about the work of deacons. All right, what thoughts do you have? What can we tell about the work of deacons? Mara?
The mystery of the faith must dwell within and be taught through them.
All right, so what does that tell us about their work?
For all.
What'd you say?
For all.
All right, so Mara recognizes that they are men of faith. They are supposed to hold the mystery of the faith well, and that means they have responsibilities to all men in that regard and to faith. Elizabeth?
Good managers and leaders.
All right, so they're good managers and leaders. Where do you see that in 1 Timothy 3?
Managing their children and their households.
Yeah, so they manage their own children and their household well. And I think you could look at similar places and say they're supposed to be not greedy for dishonest gain and blameless. I think that would indicate trustworthiness and responsibility, which we usually think of that in the frame of, is the man trustworthy? But instead, when we put it through the lens of their work, you could say that means the work of a deacon is such that they need to be blameless, they need to be trustworthy, they need to be responsible in order to do it. It's not unimportant, it can't be ignored, it can't be handled poorly. These are men of character, of faith, and the work demands that level of commitment and maturity. Julie?
They need to know where the crucial bounds are for their work.
All right, so they need to know where the scriptural bounds are for their work. And you can understand some of that through here as they need to be tested first. So we can see that they understand, that they have knowledge, that they have deep faith. Great. What else? Alan?
They need to handle money well.
All right, they need to handle money well. In the special servants class, we noted this a couple times. There's a lot more passages about elders, but in every passage about elders, there is a mention that they can't be greedy for dishonest gain. And then also here with deacons, it's mentioned, Paul mentions it with the elders of Ephesus in Acts when he talks about that false teachers are going to come in and they're going to be greedy for dishonest gain. There's a lot of responsibility that's going to be placed in these men. They will have the ability to potentially use money in ways that is not only unwise but sinful. And so we need to have men who can be trusted to handle the money purse well, whether they are in charge of the money specifically as like a treasurer, or if they are entrusted with funds to do some part of their work. We want them to be men that are trustworthy in that regard. Callie, were you going to say something?
That the work has a spiritual impact as much as physical.
Yes.
In Acts 6, where it talks about being full of the Holy Spirit, it tells me it's more than just like a physical, it's actually like it has a spiritual impact.
Yes, so in case you couldn't hear Callie, what she said is, if you think about Acts 6, the fact that they're supposed to be full of the Spirit, and then there's multiple places in 1 Timothy 3 that you would see spiritual requirements being placed. And actually, no physical requirements are mentioned unless you consider having children a physical requirement, right? All of the requirements are spiritual. And so often, and I mentioned this briefly this morning, I think we can make the mistake of saying, well, elders are in charge of spiritual things and deacons are in charge of physical things, and we try to separate the world that way. I think scripturally that is a false construct. There isn't, in most cases, a difference between physical and spiritual in this regard. I mean, think about sin. Much of the sin that we are tempted to do is physical. Adultery is a physical sin, but it has spiritual implications. And that's the way it is with the service and the work of deacons as well. Even the aspects that appear to be 100% physical, they can have spiritual ramifications. A man who might be in charge of maintaining a building, if he has no regard for spiritual things, he is going to make different decisions about how this building functions from a physical plant perspective than if he's very concerned about spiritual things. If he's concerned about how the worship honors and magnifies God, he will make different decisions even though his work is physical. And so when we are considering both the work and in a month or so, the men who might do that work, I don't think we should limit ourselves to thinking about physical on one side of the ledger, on the deacon side, and spiritual on the other side. Any other comments about the work? Alan?
I see communication in there, in the fact that you're not double-tongued. You got to communicate.
Okay, so their work is going to involve communication. All work has to, right? It's impossible unless we are going to work alone on an island to not communicate. And so this concept of being double-tongued, they need to be men who can be trustworthy because their work requires honest communication with each other. Great. Crystal?
Aspects of maturity.
All right, so the concepts of aspects of maturity, wisdom, and deep knowledge, like holding the mystery of the faith, indicate again that the work requires a certain level of maturity spiritually to be able to handle. I think an example of how you could see that is in Acts 6, their work is serving widows food. Is there anything spiritual about that at all? Why would you need spiritual maturity to handle that?
Because you could do it the wrong way. You could do it very badly.
You could do it in the wrong way. And how do we know that? How do we know that you could handle it in the wrong way?
That wasn't being handled by a collaborative group.
Yeah, because Acts 6 was written. The whole purpose of the whole reason that we have this section is because there were brethren who had been charged with that task, and they were handling it in a way that did not accord these requirements of spiritual wisdom and maturity. And you can see that in that could be things as simple as if we always give the heel of the bread to the Greek widows and we give the middle of the bread to the Hebrew widows, that will leave a perception, even though no perception is trying to be left. That it's the level of maturity and wisdom that in the work they are considering implications of how people are going to interpret that work and how they conduct themselves in it. Great. Anything else? Julie?
Spiritual aspect would be, if you are a widow and not without food, you are distressed. And there needs to be some comfort.
Yes. Yeah, so the work, even though the work on the surface is physical, like providing food, well, fundamentally, these widows are in distress. That's why the congregation has to support them. And so in providing that physical care, their souls and both, I would say, spiritual and say physical soul, their hearts need to be fed and cared for as well. That's a spiritual aspect to a work that on the surface seems very, very physical. All right, so now, go ahead.
I just was going to say one thing. And we already kind of talked about it a little bit being tested first.
I think being tested first shows that they are reliable. If you give a task to someone and they carry it out, then you know the next time, and not just that one time, the next time, showing that they are reliable in carrying out that task and being able to do what you're asking.
Yeah, so the men being tested proves reliability. And many of the works that we're going to identify happen in the background. And having people who can do work that is often unseen, if it's done best in many ways, it's unseen. That requires a man who considers the work in a certain way and also can give you some indication of the reliability that's needed when we're looking at those works. Great. Chip?
One other thing I'd point out would be self-serving, not self-serving. And I get that not great for dishonest gain. I know it's a stretch, but if you're in it for yourself,
Yeah.
what being not treated for dishonest gain would be not. But in
Right. And so all of the works are not self-serving. So we wouldn't look for works that are going to lift a man up and serve him and his purposes, right? Or glorify him, right? Micah?
Just go back to the family portion. It's work reflective of family. That just like they do what they do in the way that they do for their family, they do for this family. So whatever that work would be, they're doing it as if they were a brother, a father, a mother, a sister to the person that they're people that they are assisting, helping.
I love that the concept of family should be pervasive in the work that's being done and reflective of that work. And if you think about 1 Timothy as a whole, there's multiple parts of it that talk about how we should treat one another as family. In the next chapter, right, 1 Timothy 4, Paul's going to tell Timothy about how he should treat younger women and younger men and older men, and that he's told to treat them as mothers, brothers, and fathers, and how they do that. And I would also highlight that I think indicative of their work, managing their children and their households well. That's the only thing that Paul says in this section of 1 Timothy 3 about that. But above this, when he talks about elders, he gives some more detail. He says, because if they can't manage their own households well, how will they be able to manage the household of God? I think it is appropriate to kind of pull the rest of that phrase down in here and to think about the fact that we are appointing men to work that involves aspects of management. I think sometimes I've heard people indicate that we appoint men to be deacons, they are the servant and they do all of the work. I don't personally think that is accurate. I think deacons are called to lead in service. Much of that will require direct service on their own part, but they need to be able to manage the household of God and rally us to maintain and continue that service in many, many regards. All right, let's go on. So now, underneath that 1 Timothy 3 section, you should see a table that has 3 columns. We're going to work on those columns a little bit. But before that, look above 1 Timothy 3. You should see a red box. Write your name in the red box now. I see a lot of you not writing. I hope that means you already wrote it. I'm going to stare you down later. Good job. The reason that we're doing that is we're going to take these up at the end. Because one of the reasons that I suggested to the elders that we do this way is often when we ask for feedback from the congregation, 1, it can come in slowly, and 2, it doesn't come in. And so doing this together as a family, part of the goal is so that we collect feedback now so the elders can use it. You have weeks to provide more feedback to them, but this will give them a bolus to start with for consideration. All right? So make sure your name's on it because we are going to pass these in. And if you want this chart for some reason, I'm happy to send it to you so you can make more notes at home. All right, we're going to take these at least a column at a time, especially for the first one. So I want to take 45 seconds. So this is definitely time pressure. And write down areas of work that you believe that we need men to be dedicated to. There's 7 or 8 slots here. If you don't think that's enough, conveniently the entire backside of this sheet is blank, and you can write more there. Ready? Go. All right. You got 10 extra seconds. Give me one. Anybody?
Benevolence.
All right. Crystal mentioned benevolence. All right. Another one. Curriculum, like in Bible classes. So curriculum, Chip said under his breath teaching, and since he's an elder, he can give feedback that way.
Worship,
Worship. When you say worship, what do you mean?
like Sunday and Wednesday services.
Okay, services. I had written down in terms of worship, that there potentially is like 3 ideas there. There's like the structure of our worship and maybe when it happens, if we have specific goals or efforts in any of our services, and then also just like there's a lot of assigning and management to do of just making certain worship happens and that there's people to do all the things. Great. Mara, is that you? Yeah, Mara.
Communication, with various groups, like evangelists, communication with elderly, communication with each other, communication via social media, just overarching communication.
Okay. Communication, elders, evangelists, groups. All right. What others? Micah.
Development or mentorship, development and mentorship.
All right. Development or mentorship. That's one that I think folks with a business background, you start to feel very businessy about that. But like fundamentally, Ephesians 4, if we reframed development and mentoring and called it equipping, you couldn't help but know that it is an extremely biblical thing for us to focus on. Yeah. Great. Any others that haven't been mentioned? Yes, ma'am.
I would say outreach to the community.
Okay. Outreach to the community. What do you mean by that?
I mean, even like in my mind, like in Florida, because this is a big college town, so many colleges are. I think it would be really necessary to make sure the college is
Okay. All right. Any others? All right. Financials. Okay. Elizabeth?
Carry the managing the needs of the elderly and shut-ins.
All right. Needs of elderly and shut-ins. I guess you can use Acts 6 as an example of that one. But I do think that it's good to, in some ways, separate those from benevolence, right? Like those are two sometimes overlapping but distinct sorts of needs, potentially. Any others?
building maintenance, things like that.
All right, so building maintenance, facilities sort of feel. All right.
And then the part you mentioned, that like our digital presence, so that could involve social media, our website, search engine optimization.
All right, digital presence. SEO was real big in the New Testament. No, that's a great one. And potentially kind of dovetails a little bit with Mara's mention of communications and your mention of outreach in the community. Like how are we communicating and owning our presence in both physical and digital ways? Great. David Lee?
Similar to that, just like the way that we are perceived by a visitor that comes in our door for the first time, by the people who drive by our sign, like what is the perception that we're giving off as a body of Christians? First impressions and beyond.
All right. Any others? Julie? Okay, audio-visual? Yeah. Yeah, I would think about audio-visual sorts of stuff as very distinct skill sets versus some other physical things, right? Okay. Michael? Oh.
I feel like special events, anything that's like an event here that's not our
typical worship, that somebody would take charge of that?
Say more.
Like coordinating flyers and coordinating that on the website. I think just all the things I think we eventually got to fall on. Like, I know Chip was mentioning, like, our Daniel Frog or all, not something they're even on the website. So, that might fall into the digital presence.
No, but that's okay. Yep.
But it takes somebody to coordinate.
Right. Well, and what's interesting about you saying that is I hadn't even considered some of those things. We've already talked about communication, outreach to the community, and digital presence. And in that, I hadn't even thought, like, well, we should probably make sure somebody updates the website with meetings. Like, you know, that's one of those examples of, like, there's a lot of cracks for things to fall in. Part of preventing things from falling through the cracks is making certain that we have folks who are trying to own those things as well as they can. Great. Any others? All right. So first, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I have 13. I think some people may have some more. Some people may have less. To be really clear, in 4 to 6 weeks, or 4 weeks, the elders don't anticipate coming to say we need 13 deacons. I can speak for them in that regard. I've talked to them about that. They don't plan to say that. And so, one, as we go through this process, I would encourage you not to think, oh, well, if they didn't pick the deacon I thought we needed, like, that means they don't like me. That's not necessarily, I mean, that's not what it means. It's not necessarily, that's not what it means. But it does mean that we have limited qualified men. So one, we can't have necessarily 13 discrete deacons in charge of each of these. Some of these may not need someone to be solely owning them. Perhaps multiple of these could be bundled together and have ownership of a few of them and accountability for a few of them. Great. Now I want us to take a minute or two and talk about what benefits you see. And you can, if you want to use some that were shouted out that you didn't have written down, you're welcome to do that. Or ones that you wrote down, I'd love you to write down benefits that you see from having someone, having a deacon in charge of that aspect of our congregation. Write it down on the sheet of paper so the elders will have that feedback in a moment. All right, I don't think we'll be able to go through all of these, like all 13, and I'm not necessarily saying like we need to go, top to bottom. But I'm interested in your feedback in the things that you wrote down in your list. What sorts of benefits do you see from a given work or area? Crystal?
I really like the fact that people, so the benefits that we are we able to help someone, no one feels like seeing worker, and making sure that everyone has an opportunity.
All right, so Crystal noticed quite a few benefits to having someone who owns the concept of equipping. And in summary, one of the things I would say is simply having one person who we have said, if you don't feel like you're being equipped, here is someone who you should consider talking to. I would say you should talk to the elders, but having someone who is in charge of helping you feel more equipped in whatever ways you want to serve could really change how we each think about growth and how we grow. Great. What others? Christy?
I think this applies to
Being organized applies to a lot of different things. If you have someone that is arranging things and organizing things, it makes it easier for those that are trying to maybe do classes or trying to the worship service goes very smoothly, that's organized rather than people running smoothly doing what all the time. I think organization, when someone that is able to organize and bring things together and make it cohesive so that everybody kind of knows what's happening and there's not a lot of questioning and there's not, who do I ask for that? Who do I go to that for that? How do I need to do this? That, to me, I cannot stand this organization. I just, me as a person, like to have an organization, so that makes me feel safe, makes me feel like I know what's happening and it makes me not less stressful.
Yeah, so the concept of organization, if you didn't hear Christy, one of the things she said is like, that doesn't necessarily fit to one specific. There's multiple, at least I would say half on the list that's in front of me, that you would say some aspect of organization is what is the primary or a primary benefit that comes from having a deacon in charge of that thing. Classes, worship, you can think of multiple others, that there's a lot of parts to organize. And we can't just expect them to organize themselves on their own. And so again, if we put this through the lens of if we don't have a deacon who owns them, our elders will need to be significantly involved. Well, each of those things represents something that we would be asking them to organize potentially. Michael?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say is another clear benefit for all of these is the elders aren't doing it. If somebody's really taking charge, that means it's off the elders' plate and they can do what they should be doing.
Yeah, so, and this morning I may have given some impression that the elders have said like, oh man, we are so overworked and overburdened, we just can't bear it. That's not what's happened, to be clear. But instead, what they have said to me is that they're seeking to really enable and empower more complete service of the deacons. And in so doing, enable and empower more complete service from the brethren that those deacons are helping to serve. That the more that we, expectation and work in some ways, oversight that we roll up to the elders, well, that's fewer minds who are doing that. And so they don't have they can't do all of that themselves necessarily, especially if we want to do those things to their very best. And so enabling everyone to serve and enabling those deacons to serve more fully is the goal. It's not that the elders are like, we're going to quit because we are tired. That's not the situation. Great.
I'm not sure this was actually covered in something else that I can hear, but when we talk about the elderly and the needy, taking care of them, it can be visits, it can be groceries, it can be doctor visits, it can be financial, a lot of times, in some cases, a rights to church. It's a lot of things that people have specific needs that are specific to them.
Yeah. People have specific needs, And knowing those needs is the primary part of fulfilling them. And so having people who we have expectation that they understand and comprehend those needs to help all of us serve better is a key aspect. Great. Any other things? Callie?
I think having someone over Bible classes is good to like coordinate like the goals and objectives of those Bible classes with the curriculum and who's teaching them and what we expect the children to gain from them. And like having someone over that instead of it being kind of here's someone kind of working on curriculum, here's someone organizing the teachers, you know, having someone cohesive, putting that whole package together.
Yeah.
And organizing it is a good benefit.
Yeah, so managing and organizing the classes, there's a lot to do there. You know, there's both curriculum, there's who's doing what, there's what our goals are in that. Having one person who's involved in all aspects of that should improve the outcomes and the cohesion of them. Mara?
There's special skills that some men and families have that and others may not have. Like they may not know how to run the AV team, but this guy has really good at it. He gives it message. He can start teaching other people to do it too.
Yeah.
So it's a benefit not only to the elders, but it's a benefit to the catching on useful skills. I do have a question.
Yeah.
So in Acts 6, there was a problem.
Yep.
And I specifically don't know all the problems that Danny has. Danny and Chip, and they need to communicate. What is taking up their time? Like I can probably come up with a list that things might, but I feel like we need to hear from them about what specifically.
Yeah, and I know they got some emails from some folks today that would indicate some questions about are there things that are specifically taking up that time. So I'll let them decide how they're going to engage the group on that. But I agree, and I had that conversation with them as prepping for the lesson. Are there things in their time that are taking up, you know, large amounts of time? So hearing from them is important. I agree. Anything else? Chip?
I'll just take time to address that just briefly.
Okay.
They're really, I'm glad you brought that up that way, Laura, because Acts 6 talks about a problem that needs to be addressed. There's not a problem that needs to be addressed. Things are doing extremely well. We think that the church is functioning fantastically. There's such a good family with so many people who are willing to do anything they're asked to do. But what we think is that the way the deacons have been selected and going forward, for sure, when we select deacons, we would like the church to determine or identify what role you want them to fulfill, and not put that on the elders. To say, okay, you trust the elders just to put where you think they best to be deployed. I don't know that that's saying that the church has empowered those individuals and entrusted fully those individuals to do that work. So if we pick somebody to go over the curriculum, and the church said, wow, I wouldn't have picked the person I would have picked over the curriculum. Well, who would you? And so we want to hear that because I think it should be someone that we think it should be someone that the church picks so that that person knows. The church chose you. We didn't choose you. They trust you. They think you're capable. We believe them. We trust you. And so that's part of the thing. It's not necessarily that it's a problem as much as it is that we would like all the deacons to feel completely empowered, trusted, because the church believes them to be capable to do the things that the church has selected.
Maybe I should have said if something was not being done, it would be a problem. Like if we did not have some of our classes, which
We now don't.
anymore.
Yeah.
That would probably be taking up a lot of time. So
Yeah.
if someone were not already filling in those gaps, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had in my notes for my study this morning as well that we are in some ways in a bit of a different situation. They had a single clear need that arose, and then the elders or the apostles brought that. And in some ways, we're in a very different situation because this congregation's existed for, depending on how you count, either 25 or like 70 years. So if you count with this building or other buildings, right? And so we aren't in the same situation in terms of there's no one assigned to any works. And so is there a problem is in some ways like a different question, because we're not in the exact same situation they were in Acts 6. But we could be, right? And so one example of that is Jerry was the deacon in charge of teaching. He is gone now, and as a result, we do actually have a problem that's okay for now, but it will bubble up and grow if no one is assigned to that, right? Similarly, Clyde handles our finances and many other things outside of that. Clyde and Julie will be moving very soon. Again, that will bubble up as a problem if it's not anticipated and addressed appropriately through this. But you could see that the situation in Acts 6 could happen here, right? If, for example, let's act like we don't have a deacon in charge of benevolence necessarily, or maybe we only have one man, and a tornado went through and took out half the members' houses. We might say, as a congregation, elders, we need more men who are going to be in charge of benevolence and serving in this way. Elders, this is a need that we have. And they would say, great, tell us the men that you think should fill those roles, and we will appoint them if they meet the qualifications as we see them, right? And so this push and pull of like, our congregation has existed for a long time, so it's slightly different than Acts 6, but problems will arise if we don't kind of do that, I believe. I'm not going to take us through the concerns that you have about this area. We won't talk about those just because I don't want to belabor the point and spend too much time this evening. If you have those notes, I hope you've put some of them down. And when I say concerns, I don't just mean that you think, oh man, something could just go really haywire in this area of service. It could be, I'll share one that I don't think Chip will mind me saying. I know that Chip has a personal belief that you should probably have two men dealing with benevolence because of some natures of that work. And that's true for a few of them potentially. And so Chip on his sheet, he can then hand it to himself, would say, on the benevolence line, one concern I have is that not only one man be assigned this task, because I think it needs more wisdom or more time or more thought or more checks and balances. For example, you might want two men who are in some way in charge of the finances because you don't want any one person to hold the checkbook sort of feel. Those are great things to write down and make known so the elders can take them into account as they are thinking about how we proceed, how many deacons we need, how will potentially some men have multiple roles or just one role, and those sorts of things. I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. As I mentioned this morning, as we as a group are willing to study and come to the conclusion that maybe a tradition of how we have done something is not how we should do it going forward, that can sometimes lead to some discomfort and well, how are we going to do that now? And you may look at this kind of time together and say, like, well, that was kind of weird. Like, we kind of already knew all the good things about having deacons, so why do we talk about that? You might be right. But we have to start this conversation somewhere. We have to seek to make change together in this way. And part of doing so peacefully, in my view, is that we give one another space to ask questions, space to share thoughts, and space to make certain that concerns can be aired if we have them, either in this very public way or even, written down or said later. Because if we don't have the feedback, if we don't know your concerns or your desires, a leader can't respond to them. And fundamentally, maintaining peace and unity requires open communication from both sides of the leaders and the followers. So thank you. If you would, I see a couple people still making notes. So I'm going to let you keep these for now, if you're still making a few notes. My request, though, is that you either put them on this podium as you exit. You might not exit this way, but feel free to use this one if you do, or the podium in the back. And that you set these down so that we can collect them and the elders can start kind of collating the feedback and thinking about how they're going to communicate that in the next few weeks. We're going to stand and sing Jesus Draw Me Ever Near, I think 650, and be encouraged to draw near to our Savior in all ways. Let's stand together and sing.